Hello, everyone. See, people are slowly joining here. We'll get started in just a moment. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate you taking the time to join the webinar today. My name is Carlos Moncada, Director of Client Services. I will be your host for this Peer Spotlight webinar focused on limited submissions. Our special guest panelists today are from Louisiana State University. We have Dr. Stephen David Beck and Dr. Christopher Michalski. So thank you two for joining. Really appreciate you taking that time to share your experiences and best practices that you have put together over time using the system to help you manage your limited submission processes. The webinar today is scheduled for an hour. There's going to be about 20 minutes for presentations, and then the balance will be for Q&A with the panelists. So we had several questions submitted ahead of time during registration. And if you have any questions that you think of during the webinar, please use the Q&A tool to submit those questions, and we'll get as many answered as possible during our Q&A portion of the show today. As a reminder, the phones are muted, so please do use that Q&A tool to submit the questions. Some of you may have called in with a phone instead of using your computer. In that case, just double checking to make sure your phones are muted as well. This webinar is being recorded and will be available in the next week or so after we edit. Let us know if you would like a copy of the webinar or the presentation slides. I do believe our wonderful folks on the marketing team also plan on sending out a follow-up email that will contain that as well. And lastly, there will be polls throughout the webinar, not a post-webinar survey, just polls. So with the logistics covered, I'm going to turn it over to our great panelists today, the doctors, Steve and Chris.
Well, thanks, Carlos, and welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to be here and share some thoughts about how we do limited submissions. Our objectives for this webinar is to first and foremost share our limited submission competition process, kind of how we do it, why we do it, how we got there. Discuss the impact of using InfoReady to manage these processes, and then to talk a little bit about some of the future directions that we have for ourselves in how we improve the process. So next slide. So I did want to talk a little bit about Louisiana State University. We're an R1 research university. We're the state flagship university. We have land, sea, and space grant programs at our institution. And annually, our research expenditures hover around the $150 million mark. We also have two other campuses within the LSU system that are in the Baton Rouge area. Our Ag Center is really on our campus and part of our campus, and then the Pennington Biomedical Research Center is about 5 miles away from us in town. And the three campuses together report together on HERD, which represents about $300 million in annual research expenditures. As of 2019, Our student population is a little under 26,000 students, 26,000 undergrads, almost 6,000 graduate students, and a little over 1,800 faculty to serve them, for a total population of about 31,000 students. Next slide. And I wanted to highlight some of our research strengths. I'm sure you have heard about some of our strengths in the athletic programs, but our research strengths are really quite remarkable. We are one of the institutions involved with gravitational wave astronomy, and the LIGO facility is about 30 miles away from us, and it's operated by LSU faculty, staff, and students. We also have a tremendous amount of research going on in coastal and wetlands research. A few years back, we did an analysis of our programs, and roughly 20% of our faculty are involved in coastal or wetlands research of some form or another. We have a very strong veterinary and biomedical sciences research going on between the vet school here on campus and the Pennington and Ag Center activities. Computational science is a major thrust here at LSU. We also, on the humanities side, humanities and arts sides, we also have a very, very strong tradition of Southern history, Caribbean history, Civil War history, creative writing, and our visual and performing arts programs are really stellar, and some of the things that we're well known for. Next slide. But now it's time to really talk about how we use InfoReady. So we use InfoReady as our internal grants and competition portal. Initially, we started off working just with limited submissions and faculty awards, but we've expanded our use to include our internal grants programs, including our travel grants and research grants. And we also use it to manage and route administrative approvals that don't flow through our electronic research administration platform. So things like F&A waivers and cost sharing approvals all go through InfoReady. We also have two other units on our campus that have a platform that share the platform, and that's our graduate school and the Louisiana Biomedical Research Center, which use it for similar kinds of purposes. Next slide. We also use the Engagement Hub as a way of providing a more visual interface for our limited submission competitions. We tie this into our regular website, and it provides an easy way for people to kind of see what's available in the limited submissions arena. Next slide. So I know that you all know this probably, most likely. You wouldn't be here if you didn't, but I just wanted to go through and talk about what a limited submission is. It's the professor in me that has to put this out there. So funding sponsors sometimes limit the number of applications that come from an applying entity like a university or a research institute. The NSF, NIH, all of the major federal agencies have RFPs that have such limits. We also see a lot of them through private foundations that have those kinds of programs. And so we refer to them, and everybody pretty much refers to these programs as limited submissions. It's just a nice shorthand to figure out what we're talking about. Next slide, please. And as part of our role at the Office of Research and Economic Development, it's our responsibility to manage the selection processes for any limited submission program that a faculty member or researcher wants to submit to. And this includes collecting letters of intent, collecting pre-proposals, identifying the reviewers, reviewing the pre-proposals, selecting the winning proposal, as so to speak, and then informing our Office of Sponsored Programs as to who are the authorized PIs that can submit to a particular limited submission program. Next slide. So I'm going to let Chris take the next couple of slides. So Chris.
So I work in a smaller part of the office that is oriented around proposal development, and one of our tasks is identifying funding opportunities. And of course, part of those are limited submission competitions. And so the way the process works is that we'll, my colleague and I, Kelly Robertson, will go through a variety of different funding opportunities and check to see if they're limited first. And based on when they come out and when their final deadlines are, we'll identify internal dates for researchers to enter in their letters of intent, and so that we can develop a review process. Sometimes, and especially actually recently, the Department of Energy, for instance, has been putting out some competitions that are due within a month or so. So sometimes they're extremely short turnarounds that we'll have to alter the way how much information we're asking from researchers and truncate the internal deadlines for that. The way we announce them is LSU has gone through a few iterations, some that I'm sure I'm unaware of from before I was part of it, but in the time that I've been at LSU, they transitioned from more or less emailing all researchers as announcements came out. That ended up causing quite a bit of email fatigue, and so in the past few years, we've struck upon a system where we announce them weekly. We announce all funding opportunities weekly, and we have enough limited submissions, and also because of the time sensitivity of them, we end up announcing limited submissions every week. And so we'll announce those pretty broadly, and then also if there happen to be very specific limited submissions, we'll find the researchers on campus who might be most interested in that and send them to them directly. And with that announcement will be an internal deadline for a letter of intent, which might just be the simple literal intent to apply to it, or we might ask directly for a fuller pre-proposal, a couple of pages of the research abstract. And then while we're announcing them and identifying them, we're also keeping in mind the possibility or probability of there being a competition and how we might need to identify or contact potential reviewers. Next slide. And so you'll see here, I'm not going to walk you through this whole thing, but we did end up determining that limited submissions come up in such a bizarre way sometimes. As I mentioned recently, the Department of Energy has been giving us a run for our money. And so we've, over the past couple of years or so, developed a pretty laborious flow chart. We found it necessary just for institutionally so that we could figure out for any future generations, and in any sticky situations, if we have a flow chart that can help us identify exactly when we ought to be announcing these limited submissions. Sometimes we'll know about a limited submission competition years in advance, or at least several months in advance, but sometimes it'll be just a month. And so we have established, as you can see, this kind of intense flow chart that will tell us if we can have an open, broad competition, meaning allow everybody a leisurely time to submit a letter of intent, and if we have more interested parties than we can allow, we'll ask for pre-proposals and contact reviewers and get them to review the pre-proposals and then get back to the researchers and let them know who was awarded the slot. Or if it's a much shorter turnaround, we might only be able to do what we call first to notify, which is just that if you see it first, you get that spot. And so this system helps us determine that. Slide. So I was alluding to the fact that we identify reviewers. We have talked about the notion of having a standing committee, and I think in many ways that would probably be ideal. There's a lot of institutional inertia behind doing that, since you have to identify people who a wide array of researchers who can be ready and have this be a standing part of their commitment to the university. I think that would really be an excellent way to do a limited submission process. But as it is, we've been using an ad hoc review where we identify the researchers, or we identify reviewers who can help us determine the best awardee to go forward, simply competition by competition. And that has worked out pretty well. The hardest part is, like I said, in these short turnaround situations when we may not have enough time to contact, make initial contact with reviewers, and then if they are not able to make it, identify new reviewers who could take their place. And so if you can see on the right, we have an kind of ideal assignment of deadlines that are preferred, so that we can back up from when the agency's submission deadline is. We can back up to figure out what's an ideal timeline for us to get full review in place. Next slide. So in terms of how InfoReady has helped us, so I came into working on limited submission competitions at LSU when InfoReady was already in use. And so Steve will be able to speak a little bit more about how it compares to previously. But I can say that the impact of using InfoReady is, even in the time that I've been there, is we've greatly increased our capacity to manage limited submission competitions. Part of that is because we can replicate competitions year after year and keep track of them. We can see, based on the calendar, literally, how many limited submissions we were putting out last year. We can replicate ones that are recurring, and that helps us be able to dig a little deeper for more limited submission competition. So instead of every year rediscovering the same limited submission competitions, we can already have those on deck and ready to go. The competitions are already created, and we can spend more of our funding opportunity research time in finding ones that are more out of the way.
So,
go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I can talk about the, how the broader impact on this is. Before we were using this, we were using email. I think we've got a slide on coming up about that, and it just was kind of nuts. But what InfoReady really has done for us is it's made the process easier for everybody, and for whether it's an end user, for the reviewers, or for the administrators, us. As Chris was saying, the ability to replicate competitions year over year is really a valuable time saver, especially for the programs that we know are going to be the same year after year. Can we go to the next slide? So, and here's the slide. So before InfoReady, so we handled our limited submission competitions through an email newsletter. We announced them through the newsletter. We collected letters of intent using RedCap, which is, if you're not familiar with it, it's a platform for collecting data through that's used heavily in the biomedical community. And the person who was running the program was someone who was very familiar with RedCap and our LBRN, the Biomedical Research Network, had a license for it, so we used it. And then we collected the pre-proposals by email. We distributed email reviews by email. We tried to get review panels to meet in person to identify successful applications, and this was just fraught with problems. Next slide. Yeah, so it was really problematic. Letters of intent were lost, pre-proposals were lost, reviewers got lost, couldn't find where we were trying to have a meeting, and it was hard just to get people to come. So next slide. So where is the problem? And the problem really is using email as the way you collect materials. It's a singular point of failure. Emails get lost, they get missed, they get buried, they're hard to track and document. And what we found in that time, kind of before we were using InfoReady, was that there was a lot of mistrust in the process of who we were selecting as winners for limited submissions. For some of the competitions, there was a lot of money at stake, and people felt that the process, it's not that the process was corrupted, but that they couldn't trust that the process was completely transparent. Other issues, getting reviewers to meet in person was really time consuming, and it took so much effort and person power to organize that it really was having an impact on the other things that we needed to do as a unit. And it really did take away our human resource from the things that we really needed to do. Next slide, please. Once we started using InfoReady, we were collecting data through a portal, and it made the collection easy to document, easy to track, easy to archive, easy to search. It significantly increased the number of competitions that we could even manage. It allowed us a way of being consistent in the recurring competitions, and it really created a safeguard for these turnaround announcements, because it was we knew that these programs would be recurring. We set it up, it would happen again, and everything would be great. It would be there and ready to go. Next slide. But the other thing that we found that was really helpful was the automatic email responses. They provided a real sense of transparency to the process. People who submitted, when getting a response, they knew that it was the system responding, but because they knew that there was a system, they felt more comfortable that someone would actually read the submission, read the proposal or the letter of intent. They felt confident in what was happening. Another thing that we could do was that the reviews could happen asynchronously. Instead of having our reviewers meet in person, we could send out the reviews to the reviewers. They could review it at their leisure and simply submit the review remarks back to our office, where there would be a discussion on who would be the selected candidate or the selected proposal. And faculty immediately embraced this process. Our user satisfaction increased, and the general trust in our office increased, and that was huge. It really did allow faculty to feel confident about what we were doing, and what we were doing would be fair and consistent. Next slide. And so just to kind of document what we were doing, before fiscal year 2016, we used InfoReady for about half of the year, and before that was our old process. I do not have the data for before that, and I'm trying to find it, and it would be really nice to have. But I think you can see right here, from the time we started using InfoReady, our capacity to handle opportunities doubled. We went from 49 to 94. It almost doubled, and our capacity to manage applications also doubled over that same period. So we maintained a kind of participation level that was consistent, so that we had the same number of participants at the beginning as we did at the end per opportunity, but the number of actual applications rose significantly over that time. And without adding any additional staff. In fact, we actually reduced the number of staff working on limited submissions over the course of the past 4 years, simply because, and especially from before, because we simply didn't need it. And we had, and that allowed us to have the capacity to both handle more competitions and do all of the things that we needed to do for our office. Next slide. We did want to talk a little bit about future directions. We want to start using progress reports to track post-limited submission competition successes. Right now, our InfoReady doesn't speak to our ERA directly, but we're trying to build in some data points so that we can take the data from InfoReady and tie it in something like Tableau or some kind of analysis tool to see where our success rates are happening further down. And so that's a major thrust that we're trying to do. We're also going to try to, for historical purposes, find prior data so that we can really see the transformation from before to after using our digital system. But also having an improved integration between our engagement hub and our website. Right now, we're in the process of redeveloping our entire website. So that integration is going to be part of that activity. Next slide. So a couple of key takeaways. Managing competitions by email is a bad idea. Don't do it. If you are doing it, do something else. It really is, it breeds mistrust, and it makes it just difficult for everybody involved. Next slide. And then using portal systems like InfoReady really do make a significant difference. They enable support for auditing of processes. It actually provides data, really good data for longitudinal studies if we wanted to look that far back on kind of how certain competitions have gone. And replicating annual activities is really easy. The strong user interface leads to end user satisfaction. And what you get then is happier end users, happier reviewers, happier administrators, and and happier deans. You get more participation, and everybody wins when you start using a system like that, and you're focused on that. Next slide. I think that is it for us. So we're happy to answer any questions that you may have. And Carlos, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate all of those good tips you shared. Now, we do have several questions that have been submitted through Q&A and some questions that were submitted in advance. So let's dive in. I know people really like this portion of the webinar. First question. You mentioned reducing staff that handle limited submissions. What number did you have at the start versus now? And did they just did they just do limited submissions, or did they have other duties, and what are they doing now?
Sure. So when I first came to the office, we had 2.5 persons working on this. We had one person whose primary responsibility, well, we had a group that is now called the Office of Research Advancement, which is Chris's group. And we had 2 full-time dedicated people to that. Part of their responsibility was managing the limited submissions. And then my position as Associate Vice President was to help manage and oversee that whole process. So it was not all of my activities, but I would say that I spent a good quarter to half of my time addressing some of these issues and going through. When we moved to InfoReady, some of those responsibilities were eased off of the Office of Research Advancement, or what is now the Office of Research Advancement, and we actually had 4 individuals starting to work on it. But as we got better and as we got more, as we developed more strengths, the focus really came down to, it really became Chris handling a lot of the, most of the technical aspects of it, kind of putting competitions into the system, Kelly Robertson, who directs the Office of Research Advancement, does a lot of work on collecting the actual information for the competitions and getting that into the system. But that's pretty much it. I oversee the process, but I mean, Chris and Kelly really have the system down so that there really is no need for additional manpower, and it really is a very efficient program. And so my kudos to Chris and to Kelly Robertson on that. So we had people who were really heavily focused on it. We added more people to get to kind of wrangle it and get a good handle on it, and then it just consolidated as we got better and better at the process.
I will say, and I appreciate your kind words, Steve. I will say though that, and just so that no one's misled out there, we have found it to be quite a bit of work, and so it's I mean, part of the reason that Kelly and I are largely able to handle it is because of InfoReady, because it. And also, I think Kelly's a bit of a superhuman. She's very, very good at finding lots and lots of opportunities and making sure we get them out there. But it's just because I see that there's another question in there about how much Central Research Office effort goes into it. Specifically as person months, I'm not sure how to exactly answer that, except that I would say if one person were to work on it, I feel like that would be an entire full-time job. It's because it's pretty significant to just find funding opportunities, vet them, set them up, do the review process, follow all of that. It's pretty significant. So I'm not really great at that administrative that kind of an answer about how many person months, but it's a significant amount. So
I think the key is that between you and Kelly, you've been able to wrangle it in a very efficient manner. It does take a lot of time, but Chris's other role is primarily as a grant writer and helping other people with their proposal writing. So so I don't know if that fully answers the question, but.
I see there's a question there. It says, I'm sorry, Carlos, I didn't mean to jump on you. I just saw it. But it mentioned, are you able to store reviewer scores and comments for each pre-proposal submission? The answer is yes. We have those. Those are all available to us, and we can look back at them
Right.
at any point.
Yeah, and there, I wanted to dig a little deeper into what you were saying, Chris, about the effort involved in the limited submission world that you're managing, right? Because it's for the full life cycle, part of it is finding those opportunities. So could you talk a little bit more about what tools you use to find the opportunities, and also how you go about selecting what you will be promoting and sharing with your faculty members?
Sure. Yeah, and I think I remember seeing that there were some questions about that. In terms of identifying funding opportunities, there's of course grants.gov and also SPIN. What is it? Info. Is that InfoEd?
Yeah, that's InfoEd. That's part of our. So someone had asked about what platform we're using for our ERA, and so we use InfoEd Global for our pre-award, post-award, COI, IRB, IACUC, and SPIN comes with that. But we our system already had a system-wide license for SPIN, but it's part of that.
Okay, so yeah, so we use SPIN and grants.gov. Those are our invaluable tools. There's also I had mentioned before, we use pretty regularly our own backlog of limited submission competitions, just in terms of finding those. And so, yeah, there's a lot of work that goes into it because you have to kind of at each funding opportunity we look at, we have to just double check. And some of them, you've gotten used to knowing it's probably not a limited submission competition, but you also don't want to miss one. And so we have to, pretty quickly check those and make sure that, if there's some kind of limit, what that limit is, or if LSU is even eligible to apply for it. And then once we announce it, I don't know what metric I would say the number of opportunities we post to the number that actually end up going to a review stage. It's a small portion of it, right? Most of, we'll put out a lot of limited submission opportunities. Some will never get, some will not get applied to. Some people will apply to, but there will only be one or two, and there, applicants, and there will only be one or two slots. And so the number of times we have to do reviews, it kind of goes in waves. So sometimes it might be a couple of months before we have a review, and then some months we'll have 3 or 4 reviews. So those go in little spurts. But once those happen, we end up, you end up having to kind of follow that particular opportunity a lot further, because we'll have to again identify reviewers for them, and acquaint them with the opportunity, and set up the the pre-proposal requirements. Sometimes we'll have to alter those per given the deadline. So sometimes if the deadline is going to be kind of short, we might ask for more information, or if the limiting factor for that competition is unusual, we might have to ask for certain requirements. And so you can't be lazy about it, and you can't, even with InfoReady kind of allowing us to keep a lot of it automated, and we can copy competitions that we've done previously, but even so, we have to make sure we're updating them properly and with the right requirements and the right deadlines and whatnot. So that can take several months just following even one opportunity along. Did that answer all of the parts, Carlos?
I think so, and then there's also some follow-up questions related to the management and functionality in InfoReady. Sure. So the question is, do you use the 2-phase competition mechanism for your limited submission? So in InfoReady, that's a letter of intent functionality.
Yes. So yeah, we do. It's if we have, or I should say, if we have the time. I mean, if we have the time, if we have 14 weeks to run an entire process, we ask for an LOI, then we ask for a pre-proposal, and then run the whole process. If we don't have the full 14 weeks, it depends on kind of the nature of the program. We might ask for, if we have enough time to run a review, we might ask simply for a pre-proposal. For example, or where it makes sense to do that. Right now, we're running a limited submission for the NEH summer stipends, and we're just asking for a pre-proposal because there's really no point in asking for a letter of intent. If people are intending to do it, they'll write a pre-proposal.
And I'll add a couple notes about the letter of intent feature in the system. So with the letter of intent feature, you can, it's a 2-phase process. So in the system, when you are done with that phase 1, collecting applications and even doing a light review if you'd like, you can choose to convert phase 1 2 different ways. If you don't need to run a competition, you can actually award directly from the letter of intent. But if you do need to have a competition, you can convert it to a phase 2 to have a full competition. And everything you did to set up phase 1 will actually be copied over to phase 2. And we also handle the communication for you. The system will create draft applications for everyone who is advancing from phase 1 to phase 2. That way they don't have to re-enter information they already entered. They just have to provide the additional information you're asking in the application form. And you can also limit phase 2 to only the people who applied to phase 1 as well. So there's quite a bit of functionality in using the letter of intent. Now,
And we take full advantage of that. There are times where we will award directly from the letter of intent, and there are times when we don't. That having the flexibility to make that decision kind of on the fly, so to speak, is really useful for us.
and here's one more thing that I have teased Steve about in the past. InfraReady does have an integration with Pivot, and so if you push funding opportunity find from Pivot into InfraReady, you can populate the data into your selected template. So what we see has been really successful for institutions is populating the Pivot data into a letter of intent template and then moving from there. Sorry, Steve.
That's okay. That's okay.
So there's been a few questions about your success rate, all phrased differently. What has been your success rate of applications that go through the limited submission process, and what are some of the metrics you use to gauge that success?
Well, so this is the million-dollar question, and the short answer is we don't know, and this is a problem. This is part of our future direction in trying to find an efficient way to link the limited submission competition results to our pre-award system and our post-award system. And so we're just now getting started trying to figure out what the best way to do that is. One way is we'll be asking for using the progress report mechanism to ask faculty to respond. So, when they've submitted a proposal and whether or not they've received the proposal. But we also know that faculty are not as responsive to these things. So what we really want to do is tie this in automatically so that we can simply search through through the data in our GoGrant system, which is our ERA, our pre-award, and then do the mapping that way so that we can actually see what's happening and when it's happening. But that's going to take a little while for us to really go back and mull over all of that data. So that's what so we don't know the answer to that. We want to know the answer to that. We're working on trying to figure out the answer to that. So that's where we are.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, that's, as you said, that's the million-dollar question.
It is.
Well, offices of research are big places.
We could do it. We could do it. It would just take, like a concerted, digging effort. And what we're working on is making it as smooth as possible, and automatic and efficient as possible.
So there's another metric-based question. What percentage of your total submissions are limited submissions?
That's a really good question. Right now, we are handling 90 plus competitions a year, but I believe the number, I'm going to put out a number, and I know it's not going to be correct, but it's somewhere in the area of, I believe the number is 2,000 proposals go out every year. Do not quote me on that. I'm not writing that number down. I'm not the right person to ask that question in terms of that particular number. I know we have that number. That's the number that seems to resonate with me from previous conversations. So it's a small number. I mean, in terms of overall between what we what we actually submit in terms of proposals, and of that, what are limited submissions. It does seem like it's a lot of work for a small proportion of our programs, but the reality is that these are many of these limited submissions are the largest proposals that we have that go out. So things like things like the MRI program from NSF, we have to run through this, and it makes that really simple and straightforward. But we have to have a mechanism to do that, and then we're obligated to do any kind of processing for someone. If someone were to find a foundation that has a very narrowly focused limited submission competition or limited submission program, we're obligated to run that process. Sometimes that process is, okay, you have it, now you can go submit it. But it is a complicated issue, but we're obligated to do everything that comes our way.
Right, and even some of the non-large ones are strategically important, like
Right.
Several of the humanities grants. They may not be big dollars, but they're extremely important for our researchers.
Right. The NEH summer stipend is a huge program for us. Not a lot of money, but huge nonetheless.
We have several questions about faculty, how you interact with them, both from an applicant perspective and a reviewer perspective. So I'll start with the applicant perspective, because there's one of those and many of the reviewer questions. So here's your question. How was buy-in initially from the researchers? Did you do a lot of training, and how did you deploy the system?
So I'll take this one since it's a historical one. We did zero training because we didn't have to. The system was so straightforward and easy to use that anyone who came in contact with it, whether it was a faculty member or whether it was a reviewer, was like, oh, I know how this works. And they did it and they submitted it. And part of it was the way we designed our forms. Part of it was, it just seemed really intuitive. And so faculty adoption was immediate, absolutely immediate. And we never felt like we needed to do any kind of training. We had to do a little more training for reviewers. But again, the hardest part in that was that we use a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being best, for all of our competitions. And it's taken a little bit of training to get our reviewers to remember that. And so there were times where we had to go in and essentially correct the scores because someone would reverse that scale, and they would say 5 was best rather than 1.
And even with on-screen labels telling you what is strong and what's weak.
Exactly.
That's one way I might even. There was another question about how much technical effort do you need on the back end, and I'd say part of it is just being able to feel a few times a year. We'll have an issue either with an applicant or a reviewer who's having difficulty with the system, and so there's a little bit of technical effort on our end of just because there's no IT way of dealing with it. That's something that we kind of handle, and so that's part of that technical effort anyway.
And Chris,
yes.
If you have to spend more than 5 minutes on helping them out, just send that over to our support team.
No, we really don't. We really don't. But that's the thing. I mean, it's never that important. It's like, sometimes they're using the wrong email than the one we sent, or vice versa, or something that we can walk them through pretty quickly. But thank you.
we use the single sign-on integration so that people with LSU credentials can log in using their LSU password. When people log in with a different email, then things get kind of screwy, and that's what Chris was.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing that Chris and
It's
I
a known user
had to
issue.
deal with. Right. It is an organic issue, not a software issue.
Yeah.
Well, and so since we're on the topic of reviewers here, and internal reviewers, with talking about SSO, the question is, your pool of internal reviewers at LSU is fairly large, but smaller universities such as mine do not have such a large pool of researchers for internal review. What do you suggest we could do?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've somebody else had asked too. They said that they tried to do, I mean, essentially there are two options as far as I can tell that are fair, and that's an ad hoc committee that you contact as the need arises, right? Or a standing committee. And I have thought that a standing committee would be great to implement, but there are issues with that too. One issue somebody brought up in one of the questions that I think was answered, like type answered, but they said that they had a standing committee, but they still ended up having to rely on only a few of the reviewers who actually answered and responded. And so, and also, those people might feel burdened over the course of however long they would be on that committee. But I personally do think that a standing committee would probably be the best thing for a smaller university. But I'll also say that even at LSU, it is a large university, but when these competitions come down to it, we are usually limited to only a few faculty that we actually can end up asking for. So I wouldn't be surprised if you ran into some similar issues, which is you kind of keep having to go back to a few of the same people for certain research areas. I don't know, Steve, how else would you?
I mean, I think you've hit. I mean, there's always an option to have external reviewers. We typically don't use external reviewers unless it's a specific a really specific kind of program that would warrant it. But that might be another way to handle it, would be to try to develop a pool of external reviewers, but then there's a cost to that. And so the question is, do you have, is the cost of having external reviewers worth the review of a particular program? And so that's something that you have to decide. But yeah, I think that, we have been talking about having a standing committee. Part of it is making sure that you have a diverse enough committee so that you avoid obvious conflicts of interest, so that you can make sure that you have subject matter experts on the program, and that you have a reward system in place. So for things like promotion and tenure, being on the, that it's a big deal to be on the Office of Research and Economic Development review panel for 3 years, that there's some real value to that. You do that, and then that makes things more palatable.
But just as an off-the-cuff thing, off-the-cuff response for a smaller university, I think something that would, I don't know if this would be possible, but something that would be really neat would be to partner with another smaller university. If you found yourself limited in the number of people you could ask who could fairly review competitions, if you find yourself constantly having a conflict of interest because you only have one or two people who can review that competition subject area, and so you're worried that they're always picking whatever, or you just don't want to burden them anymore. I think something that could really work is partnering with other universities where you could, and it could even be blinded to help.
Yeah, and someone in Q&A also added that the alumni network might be a good source of potential reviews as well. So on the same topic, for the internal review process, do you, or perhaps how do you include university-wide strategic priorities that may not be top of mind for faculty peer reviewers? So Steve, that goes into your promotion and tenure comment about making the review panel a big deal.
Right. So, but I think also the question kind of deals with how are decisions made that reflect institutional priorities. So the committee that makes the review, that does the review, is not necessarily the final word. And for large programs like MRI, what ends up happening after the review process is that a committee of our administrative staff, the vice president, myself, other associate vice presidents, will actually also review to make sure that who we select reflects the institutional priorities. So the reviews provide us information on the quality of the proposals, but the final decision is actually left to us. We only do that on a very few number of proposals, and more often than not, the proposals that we get do reflect those institutional priorities. But it's kind of I mean, it's a really good question, because it is important for us to have our institutional priorities represented in the proposals that go out to these agencies.
Thank you, Steve, for sharing that. I think we have time for one more quick question, and then we'll close it out. We're approaching the top of the hour here. Do you at LSU use the reviewer role routing step types for limited submissions or other types of competitions? And by that, the feature in the system is called department-driven routing steps, where you can map chairs and deans to to departments and colleges.
So it really depends on the competition, but yes, we do use it. We don't use it for everything, but we do use it for programs where a department head review or a dean's review is required, and that's actually for we use it for some of our internal grant programs. I don't know that we use it very much for limited submissions, but we do use it for so for example, the Southeastern Conference has a faculty travel grant program that unfortunately last year it was kind of hard to travel, but we're in the process of soliciting proposals for this year. And so we do ask, we do have that reviewer step where the PI puts their department chair email address, and the department chair then is asked to rank all of the proposals that come from their department in terms of the department's institutional priorities. And so that's part of the calculation that goes in there. So we do use that. It's really, it's a really novel way to have that kind of automatic review, because it sets us, it eases our burden in having to go and research who the department chair is and make sure that, and have it as a separate internal step. This being more automatic, it works really well for us.
All right. Well, thank you, Steve and Chris, for sharing all of your knowledge and experience with limited submissions and how InfoReady is used in that. We are at the end of our hour. I really want to thank everyone for your time today, especially you two for volunteering your time to be panelists. I have some contact info on screen here for InfoReady. If you are interested in adopting InfoReady at your institution, please contact my colleague Max Dinerman. If you want to talk about what you already have, contact me, Carlos Moncada. And if you have some technical questions, please contact our support team at support@InfoReadyCorp.com. And then if you want to keep the conversation going, if you want to connect with your colleagues at other institutions who are using InfoReady, we do have a listserv available. I'll actually launch a poll question about that right now, so we could register you if you'd like. And then lastly, we also have the referral program. So if you think another institution where you have a colleague might benefit from using the system and you'd like to pick up a discount at the same time, let us know. The link to do that is on screen here, InfoReadyCorp.com/referrals. And with that in mind, I want to thank everyone out there for your time. Hopefully this was helpful and you have a good week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.